had double the per capita income of most of the South or the Third World. By 1913 it was 3 times as much, and by 1950 it was 5 times as much. Similarly, the per capita share of GNP in the industrialized countries of the developed European core was in 1830 already twice as much, already double. By 1913, it became 7 times as high. So this was a system which fundamentally marginalized and subjugated certain parts of the world to the interests of the European core. Now, fast track, we skip the World War, we fast track to 1945, the end of the Second World War, and the dawn of a new post-war international order. Now, obviously, as the Second World War was coming to an end, people were thinking that the United States, in particular, as well as Britain, were kind of thinking, what are we going to do they thought they would win the war, pretty much. They knew they had overwhelming military strength. They were trying to think, how would we reconstruct the post-war international order? And so what you have here, I've got a photo there of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a little logo from the State Department. And in the 1940s, the State Department got together with the Council on Foreign Relations, and they started thinking how they were going to do this. They got together the academics and the policymakers and started laying down their plans. And pretty much, they consciously decided that the order that they would construct would actually be an imperial order. And the interesting thing is that today, I mean, most politicians today would not know this. They wouldn't be aware of this. They would just be like, how could you say that this is an imperial system? But in the 1940s, they knew they were designing the imperial system. They were doing it consciously. Some of them may have even had some good intentions. But pretty much what they were thinking about was how to maintain US power at this particular time. And I want to give a couple of other quotes just to give you an idea of how this worked. Grand area strategy was basically premised on this idea that if you wanted to maintain global control, there were certain areas of the world that you needed to dominate. If you didn't dominate those areas, you wouldn't have global control. So you identified these areas, and that area that overall was called the Grand Area. And the Grand Area consisted of the entire Western Hemisphere, the former British Empire, all the colonies of the British Empire, and the Far East. And they said that the economic control over this area was, quote, essential for the security and economic prosperity of the United States and the Western Hemisphere. So in other words, dominating these areas was essential simply to have security and economic prosperity. Perfectly legitimate end, you might think. But what this meant, quite interestingly, was that they had to, quote, secure the limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by foreign nations that constitute a threat to this world area. Think about that. Limitation of any exercise of sovereignty of foreign nations that may constitute a threat. In other words, if a sovereign nation decides to do something that may threaten our domination of these areas, then we have to limit that sovereignty. So all of these ideas that we're hearing now in the war on terror about, sovereignty being something that we can sacrifice for the sake of security, these are not new ideas. These are really old ideas. In fact, this goes back centuries. And it was in that context that when State Department planners and British planners were looking at what was going on across the global south, when disparate movements in Africa and Asia were rising up for national independence. They were saying, we want freedom from colonial rule. We want the right to self-determination. They didn't want that. They were coming up with plans that would allow them to effectively neuter all of these movements. And I have that quote there from D.K. Fieldhouse. D.K. Fieldhouse is a very, very reputed historian. and a renowned expert on imperial history. And he acknowledges that this is exactly what happened. The idea was to reconfigure the empire. They couldn't control directly anymore using direct force. Direct military occupation was too costly and too difficult. People were uprising against it, so they had to do something else. Economic dependence. In other words, you recede and you set up these surrogate client regimes that will operate in your interest without you having to be there, without you having to show your face and say, this is my land. No. These are independent lands, and we have given them freedom. But actually, they were economically dependent on the British and American powers. And in many ways, the Cold War was really the history of attempts to shut down decolonization. We had over 70 military interventions in the post-war period, from 1945 to 1990. And as we know, most of these were supposed to be countering Soviet expansionism. But this idea suggests that perhaps it wasn't really about countering Soviet expansionism. Maybe it was about actually trying to establish control over regions of the world that were trying to call for national independence. And interestingly, a number of actual American officials who worked in the government at the time have actually come out and said that this is exactly what was happening. That the Cold War, the existence of the Soviet Union, of course the Soviet Union was a threat. The bipolar system did exist. It limited the ability of the United States and Western Europe to do many, many things. But was it the fundamental motivating factor in the Cold War? According to Richard Barnett, it wasn't. Richard Barnett was a State Department official in the 1950s, and he said that even the word communist has been applied so liberally and so loosely to revolutionary radical regimes that any government risks being so characterized if it adopts any of the following policies. And he gives this list: nationalization of private industry, particularly foreign-owned corporations, radical land reform, autarkic trade policies, or independent trade policies, acceptance of Soviet or Chinese aid, insistence upon following an anti-American or non-aligned foreign policy, among others. So in other words, whether it was through ideology, through blind paranoia, or through ruthless realpolitik, the reality was that what we were doing from 1945 to 1990 was crushing national independence movements around the world. And there was another State Department official called William Blum, ex-State Department official, who was there for a few years before he left. He felt disillusioned. And he wrote a book called Killing Hope, CIA and US military intervention since 1945. It's this fat book, and he goes through literally case by case by case, country by country analysis based on declassified documents, mainstream press reports, and what we were doing, what the US and the CIA were doing in this period. And he says in the introduction to his book, he says this was, he dubs it the American Holocaust. How many innocent civilians died as a consequence of these military interventions? There's been a number of people who have tried to kind of actually estimate